G'day, folks. Welcome to another Make You Known podcast. Today we are talking to the author of a short, relevant, and punchy book on authenticity. The chap who wrote it is a pastor at New Community Church Sidcup, where he oversees their evening service. He can be found on Instagram and Twitter at Beard and Bible, all one word. And his name is Mr. Jon Brown. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Jon Brown.
Hello. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hi, John. Thanks for coming along. It's great to have you on board.
Shame we couldn't be face to face, but this is definitely better than nothing. You still look good on camera, so it's all right.
Well, thank you very much. I'll take that. I think it's probably better on camera than in real life, so maybe it's
fair.
Maybe we're better off for it. But yes, no, sorry not to be able to chat in real life, but hey, such is the new COVID lifestyle that we're all adjusting to. So I'm really chuffed to have you on board today, John, because the book, I genuinely found it really, really helpful. So actually, thank you very much for writing it. And it covers a huge range of topics. So you've got prayer, you've got doubt, you've got relationships, success, and all in quite a short space of time. Of course, it covers all those topics under the umbrella of authenticity. So authentic prayer, authentic relationships, even authentic doubt. So just to kick us off, could you tell us what the purpose of the book is, like who's it for, and what you're trying to achieve with it?
No, it's helpful to hear that it was a book that resonated with yourself, because my hope was it would primarily be aimed at people who have wrestled with some of the kind of deeper and perhaps more awkward questions that a lot of Christians either don't think through or don't really want to publicly say that they've thought through. And when I was growing up, I had this kind of dream, probably like a lot of young Christian kids, of seeing all my friends become Christians. And I remember when I went to university thinking, I'd love to see loads of people on my course saved and my friendship group saved. And the reality is that as the years have rolled by, I've seen more friends walk away from faith and come to faith. And that kind of obviously didn't sit right with me and didn't kind of line up with all the mantras that were given to me at the summer camps that we used to go to when we were talking about being history makers and changing the nations. I was like, I can't even see my friendship group change, let alone the nations. But no one really wanted to talk about that, this kind of tension that Jesus, the Bible says that we can taste and see that the Lord is good. But why is it that so many of my friends who seem to have tasted have decided that what they tasted wasn't good? Was it that God isn't good, or is it that they never really tasted the real thing? And those are the kind of uncomfortable questions that I think, whilst not always the easiest to talk about, are so important to. And I never had those conversations when I was younger, but I've just seen the power in my own life of being honest and real about them. And so the book really is just an opportunity for people to wrestle with some of the core parts of the Christian faith and to bring their questions, bring their doubts, and hopefully have an honest discussion about things that I hope will maybe stop some people from walking away from faith who might have, or maybe just bolster the faith of those who really want to go a bit deeper in their beliefs.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's a very a kind of classic experience that probably quite a few people have had, actually, and so I think that's a great starting point to do that. And I think we'll come back to some of the things you've touched on there as we move forward. So I just want to get a little bit of a background understanding of some of your own story. And I was interested in the introduction. You write, I reached a moment in my own life when I could no longer believe that God existed. There were too many questions, too many frustrations, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to shake off my doubts. Eventually, after some significant supernatural encounters, as well as some further wrestling with the big questions of life, my heart and mind were convinced, and I returned to my faith in Jesus. And then you go on to say how that was one of the best things that happened to you. So could you just tell us a little bit about what happened to make you stop believing, when you walked away, the story behind that, and the encounters and stuff that happened that brought you back again?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I grew up in a Christian home, and like many of us, when I got to a certain age, yeah, you had to, as we used to like to say, make your faith your own. And it was this sort of like, I'm going to decide to go to my church, even though mum and dad aren't forcing me to anymore. And I very much was all in with that. Like I was the Christian kid who, like, when I was in sixth form, like I made posters with my face on. I had a friend take some photos of me, make a poster that just had my picture saying, "I'm a Christian, ask me why." And we put it all around the school. And like I wasn't some like secret Christian, like I was going for it. And it wasn't just the kind of like, I hope no one ever finds out I go to church. Like I was like, yeah, really passionate Christian. But despite that, I think I never really did the thing that I had been asking all my friends to do, which was to explore the foundations of why they believe what they believe. And I'd never really questioned my faith. Like I'd never, um, even though I could, in the RE lessons, answer all the questions and debate to the hilt or whatever, I never really kind of, I guess, built those deep foundations. And the quote you just referenced, I think there's this heart and there's this mind element for all of us, in some more than others. Some of us are way more big thinkers and others are way more big feelers. But for all of us, it's a thing of both. And I think I got to a place where God no longer felt real, nor did I really kind of think there were plausible reasons as much as I had done before to believe in his existence. And I think those two things combined, yeah, the expectations, I suppose, versus reality. I was actually in Bible school at the time in Toronto, and it was quite a charismatic context, and all these people having these amazing, tangible experiences, and I was having none of it. And then I was just like, this is just all made up. Like I keep asking God to give me some experience, and I haven't felt anything. And then one night, it was in the middle of Canadian winter. I went out at like 1 a.m. in my pajamas. I just didn't care. I was like, God, you have to give me a sign. And I remember I was looking up at the stars, this like perfectly clear starry night. And I was like, God, if you're real, show me a shooting star, which I realize sounds so cheesy. Like that is like the most like ultimate kind of like cliche Christian thing to say. But I was desperate. I've tried everything else. So I'm like staring at the sky, like, God, please give me a sign, like show me something. I waited and waited and waited, and eventually there was no shooting star. And I just remember just like weeping, like the most I've ever wept. Like my whole body was convulsing. I don't think it was just because I was freezing cold, but I was just like, it was deeper. It's like the kind of whole of my foundation had fallen apart. And but then it was interesting, even in that moment, as I decided like God isn't real, I remember thinking, wait, so who do I believe made all these stars? Like, do I believe it was just some big bang then? Is that what I'm like, that was created by no one for no reason? And the kind of origins of everything is just a complete unknown. And I thought, I thought being an atheist would answer all my questions. I wouldn't have any more doubts. I wouldn't have any big problems with life. And then I thought, man, I have massive questions now. And so that kind of began the journey of going back to basics of what I believe kind of mentally, as it were. So I started going back to some of those core questions, like the C.S. Lewis, like, who is Jesus? Is he mad, bad, or God? Is he liar, lunatic, or Lord? Like, did I really now think Jesus was a liar or crazy? And I just wasn't convinced by that. And I'd run alpha courses where we discussed these things, and I felt silly having to go back to those questions, but they're like key ones. So that was part of it. My mind just increasingly was convinced, actually, no, I think God is real. And I almost had to kind of tear everything down to a degree to build it back up in a healthy way. And went through that process, rather than, at the moment, there's a lot of people like deconstructing things, but I don't see a lot of reconstruction. And I really took the effort and the pain to do that. And then secondly, I just had, like you read, some kind of supernatural experiences. Like I'd prayed for years to see people healed and all sorts, and was just like, man, I haven't seen any of this. Maybe it's just all a load of rubbish. But the irony is, I've given up on my faith whilst I'm still at Bible school. So I'm at Bible school, and we're having to run conferences for people. And we were at one conference where we were asked, and I've like given up on my faith at this point, but I'm like, I paid for this course, I might as well see it out and keep resting with my faith. So, I mean, it was my gap year sort of thing. And anyway, so I was at this conference, and the guy running the conference said all the students are going to come and pray for people who've got pain in their bodies, and they're going to bring a word of knowledge. And I was like, a word of knowledge? Like, I don't even know if I believe in this. Like, what? Basically, they're going to share somewhere where God wants to heal a body part or an illness. And I'm like, all right, God, if you're real, give me like some pain in my body where, and I had no faith for it. It wasn't like I had this like faith for mustard seed. It's like, well, I've got to say something. So I just felt this sharp pain in my elbow and in my wrist. And I thought, well, I might as well say God wants to heal someone's elbow or wrist. So I shared that on the stage in front of this big conference. And after a load of people came forward for prayer, I prayed for them. Nothing seemed to happen. And then I was like, standard, God's not real. There's a surprise. And then that night I was sat in the back row at this conference with my hood up, just trying to like not engage with anyone. And I saw this guy get onto the stage. And he was like, this morning when the student brought that word about God wants to heal wrist, I went up for prayer. And I've had pain in my wrist for 30 years, ever since an accident when I was younger. And as he prayed for me, I just felt all the pain go. There was this cold sensation, and I haven't been in pain since, for the first time in 3 decades. And I'm like, what? Like, how? Like, I used to pray with all this faith and no one's ever healed. And here's me, like, thinking, I don't even believe in God. And I pray for someone and they get healed. And that was a big one for me. And then just a few other things, like people bringing prophetic words, like coming up to me at church, just sharing things with me. I'm like, you don't even know me, and you're saying things that God's apparently wanted to say to me that you would have no idea because you don't know me. And yeah, eventually I got to the stage where I was like, I really do believe that the most likely thing is God is real, Jesus is God, and I don't have all the answers, but I want to build my life on this, and I can be content with not knowing all the answers, because what I've learned is no one has all the answers. But I genuinely do believe that God is real and God is good. So there's kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it's helpful for people to hear, because often it's not as simple as like, I had doubts and then I read this one book and they all went away and I lived happily ever after. Like, it just doesn't happen like that.
I think that's really interesting, and there's so many little points there, especially. I mean, to have this kind of crisis of faith when you're at Bible college, and you kind of kept going with that, and you kept going to church by the sounds of it as well.
Yeah.
Like,
well, we had to, as part of the course, we had to go to church every Sunday, but I don't think I was mentally attending church, even if I was physically there. So,
but that sounds like in the end it probably had quite a big, like a good overall outcome.
yeah.
Like a great time to have the doubt then in that respect, although I imagine it must have been quite awkward at times.
Yeah, well, I mean, we might come on to this, but one of the things I would definitely say to anyone who's struggling with their faith is stay in church. Like, even when I came back to my faith, I kept going to church, even I did not enjoy it at all. Like, I didn't like being there, but I was like, I know this is the right place for me. And even as I was wrestling with my faith, like, I think a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to check out of church until I work out what I believe. But for me, actually, just from a kind of neutral position, not a Christian one, if you're trying to be objective and study, okay, or reflect on, do I believe this? There's going to be so many arguments and voices from the culture, from our society saying one thing, that if you're trying to get a balanced opinion, you need to stay around Christians and around voices that are telling you that side as well. Because from my experience, the second people check out of church, any kind of objective reasoning or wrestling with faith, usually, from my having sadly seen lots of friends do this, that kind of goes with it. So I would say stay in church. It's painful, you'll hate it, but it's the best thing for you.
Yeah, that's really good. And this topic of doubt, obviously, you spend the first chapter talking about, and I felt that was kind of like worth reading the book for on its own in many ways, because it was. I just think not many people talk about this. So I've got a few questions about doubt, if you're happy to talk about that now. Well, why is it this thing that we probably all experience but almost never comes up in conversation, or at least in my experience, that's the case?
Yeah, my experience has been the same. When I was growing up, I never heard it spoken about, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's because we feel the weight of it. Like we know um, these are high stakes. This isn't kind of like, oh, they no longer like playing the same computer game as me, or whatever it might be. It's like, no, this is eternal consequences to these decisions. So we know the stakes are high. So I think often when we're struggling with doubt, rather than speak about it, we're like, I just don't feel like I can say anything. And I think we've also had a stigma or poor theology around it. I remember I was at a conference with tens of thousands of people, huge conference centre with a famous televangelist on it, and he said, "If you ever doubt, you don't truly have faith." And at the time, I was wrestling with doubt, and everyone's cheering him and applauding him, and I'm thinking, well, I must be a bad Christian, or maybe I'm just not a Christian at all. And so I think it's a mixture of those two things. And the problem is, if you've never heard anyone else really speak about it, like I've honestly, I sadly have never heard a sermon about it, apart from ones that I've tried to share when I've been able to, although not too many people really want a preacher to speak on doubt. I think if you've never heard a church leader talk about doubt, or whenever they do it, it's like, yeah, when I was 16, I mean, a long time ago, obviously I never doubt now, praise God. I'm 100% confident in everything. Like if you never hear your pastor, your kind of leaders talk about them, of course you're not going to think this is something we can talk about.
Yeah,
What about your
fair
experience?
enough.
Would you say yours has been similar? Have you heard lots of, maybe I've just been in the wrong sort of context. Have you had a different experience?
No, no, I think that's one of the reasons I probably found the discussion on it so refreshing when I read it, because I was like, yeah, I have wrestled a lot with it, and as I say, it's not something that's completely in the past. Like I'm absolutely convicted of where I am in. It's a difficult thing to put delicately, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
you know when people say, "Do you believe in God?" It's almost like it sounds foreign coming out of your mouth to say, "Do you believe in a God?" Because it's like, well, it's not a God. It's we know each other. There's a
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
personal. There's that personal side, but at the same time, sometimes you're just like, "Oh, I just don't get it anymore."
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And yet that kind of thing, like people just don't sort of talk about it. So yeah, I feel like if it's happened in your kind of experience in your school of growing up and that kind of circle of people, and it's happened for me, like I've definitely been at events where I've just seen all these people and they look like everything's fine,
Yeah.
and I think actually that comes into later in the book, other chap things that we'll talk about as well, is this kind of everything seems fine, but I know that it isn't for me,
Yeah.
and then that's a very isolating and scary experience because you then
Definitely.
close up. You don't want to talk about it because that puts you in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing that was interesting for me was this whole thing of comparing your experiences to others. So I remember I'd be in church services where I'd be there, and kind of the person to my left might be, crying, the other, like with, the emotion of the worship time. The person on the other side, might be kind of like lost, like just going through. Or I grew up in quite charismatic circles, so I'd literally be the person. If this is a foreign concept to some, then forgive me, but if you know what I'm talking about, you'll know, where they have this like prayer line where someone will come along and pray for everyone. Everyone's like falling over in the spirit, and I would be like the last man standing, just like stood there, like still stood up, and everyone else is like on the floor, like slain in the spirit. And like I'm there, like, wow, like, okay. And then you're like, shall I just like fake it, or maybe just kind of slump to the floor, or kind of quickly run to the toilet? Like it's so just, oh man. Yeah, I could share so many awkward stories growing up in kind of charismaniac churches. But the thing is, at the same time, it's easy to bash on those things, but I do think a lot of that is really genuine. The problem is, it's so easy to compare external experiences. So I would have friends who would talk about, oh, like I just felt the warmth of God's love in that meeting, and I'd be like, man, like I just felt hungry the whole time, like I didn't feel anything. And but then 6 months later, this person who I'd be envious of their experience of God would have walked away from their faith. And it was really interesting because I think it's very easy to look at others and be like, wow, I wish, like a close friend of mine is currently wrestling with his faith a lot. And he's like, well, in worship, everyone else just seems to be having tangible experiences and I never do. And I said to him, I rarely have any sort of tangible experience during the kind of church worship time. And he's like, really? I think it's so rare that people say that, because you only ever hear the story of the person who's like, I just felt waves of God's love washing over me. And yeah, whereas for a lot of people, it's just normal. You just worship God. It's about Him. You might get some cool experience, but ultimately it might just be singing songs of who He is. And if you're, in a position where He wants to give you some tangible experience, great. But that's not the kind of the norm necessarily for everyone. So I think we just got to be so careful not to compare with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a really helpful point for me as well, because I totally identify with that. Like, so often I would kind of I'm just like hungry for something, and nothing happens or whatever, and then I'm like, well,
Yep.
am I just not one of the chosen ones, or what's going on here? And I think, one of the things that I've come back to is that, yeah, what you're saying is absolutely right. Don't compare, but there's also a side of, well, maybe I was just going to that event or that meeting so that looking for what I could get out of it, like, or I could get a nice little warm feeling or whatever. When it's actually like, I remember a friend saying to me years ago, and it was a really helpful thing at the time, and he just said, look, God's worthy of your worship. Doesn't matter how you feel. So don't base your worship on your emotions.
That's
Um,
really good. Yeah.
and I think there's a lot in that. So do you, so with the doubt thing, do you then feel that is a lot of it about communication? Is the problem with doubt more of a communication problem, i.e., we're not talking about it? Doubt itself isn't a problem; it exists, it's a thing. And as you point out in the book, and as I've heard elsewhere, that actually, to a certain extent, doubt is the proof of faith. Um, it happens to everyone. It shows that you are, believing something. But the problem is where people have a wobble, and they let that wobble get bigger and bigger until eventually they just crumble.
Yeah, you're so right. I think it's helpful hearing you say that, because it's easy to think, oh, is that maybe just my experience or my friendship group? But yeah, I've just seen it time and time again that people who you thought were really solid in their faith and everything's going fine, never expressed any doubts or ever, all of a sudden, within a short space of time, it like the whole everything can just fall apart and they disappear. And you think, how has that happened? And the reality is, often doubt is not necessarily manifested in people saying, I doubt that God is real. In all honesty, it's often manifested in them living like He's no longer real. So that person who had really strong convictions about kind of what they were living for and what they believed was right and wrong in line with God's will, all of a sudden those things start to change. So it's not necessarily that they have some big post on Facebook that says, just so you know, guys, I don't believe God is real. But um, I think you're right. It's the thing of communication, because it has been such a taboo subject and has so much shame attached to it and fear attached to it. We've kind of got to a place where there's not. I didn't grow up a place where people were openly talking about it, so I felt so much shame around it. And praise God, He's helped me through this season. But my experience has been, most of my friends have often not felt comfortable to share, and that's been so damaging. um, and I think we just have to kind of chill out a little bit. The reality is, you can doubt have doubts, and it's not some massive huge crisis. And I think we just need to kind of, to stop it being this taboo scary subject. And as you said, you struggle with doubts. And the thing I tried to say in the book is, often wrestling with doubt is a sign of faith. It's saying, I want to find truth, I want to find answers, I want to, if God is real, I want to know Him as deeply and personally as I can. And that's very different from cynicism. It's not saying, I'm just trying to pick all the faults I can in Christianity and I'm not trying to find truth, I just want to kind of bash on it, so maybe subconsciously I can live a lifestyle that my faith is currently holding me back from. It's saying, God, if you're real, I want to see that. And at the moment, it doesn't feel like it necessarily, but show me that. And I think some of the people I know have the most resilient and deep faith are those who've been through times of real doubt, even walked away at times, but returned. And I guess my encouragement to you and any other listeners is, if you're struggling with doubt, don't see it as this kind of death sentence for your faith. Embrace it. Even like Doubting Thomas, like we give him this bad rap, don't we? Like he's just got this nickname like for life. Like his Twitter handle is now at Doubting Thomas. Like how's that happen from one moment? And it's like, yeah, we'd all be better than him. Like you saw someone get crucified, and now your mates like, oh, he's come back to life. Like how many of us, especially like Brits who are cynical about everything, would just be like, oh yes, I believe that this thing that's never happened before has just happened. Like loads of us would be him. But the thing I love about Thomas is church history would say that he then went on to do amazing things for God, and taking the gospel to India, and it wasn't like they ditched him. They weren't like, you doubted, so in a bit, mate, like we're gonna have a vote for a new disciple. Like we embraced it. There's a verse I think in James that says, have mercy on those who doubt. And it's like we don't ditch people when they're struggling. We say, hey, let's chat about this. And then some of the most resilient Christians I know are those who have wrestled with doubts the most.
Yeah, that's really good. So just to kind of wrap up the doubt discussion, as it were, before we move on, to kind of sum up some of what you're saying as well, is like your doubts today are not the end of your story.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
As you say, chill out, like don't worry about it. Then also, you don't have to put the map on a billboard. What authenticity suggests, what the more real thing suggests, is actually just have one or two people at least that you can confide in. But what would be your suggestion when it's not you who's facing doubt, but it's someone who's close to you? How do we go about being the best possible support we can? Because just sometimes if they're really struggling with doubt, just kind of going, oh, kind of being a bit trite about it, and kind of going, oh, just pray about it, or whatever. It sometimes doesn't feel like the best thing to do. You don't want to over kind of drown them in verses, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think in a lot of ways it's the same principles for helping someone through anything. It's you just have to have a lot of love and a lot of patience towards people. And the truth is, when it comes to doubt, my experience in my own life and in others is the journey of wrestling with it is often quite a long one. I think my hope, even with walking through this with people currently as we speak, going through this journey with other people, is I really want them to, like, especially when you're convinced yourself, you're like, come on, like God's good, he's real. And if you're in a good place, it's hard to be empathetic sometimes, even though for myself, I've experienced that. I still struggle with it now, but it's being patient. And ultimately it's trusting God, because you can have all the right answers and you can do all these different things, but it is a spiritual reality, a battle. Our fight is not against flesh and blood. We're not having a war against Richard Dawkins or whatever. There's a spiritual reality that's going on, and yes, we need to be intentional, and yes, we need to use our minds and do what we can to reach people. But there is a spiritual element, and I think it's praying for people. But a key thing, just linking back to before, is not is thanking people for sharing it. The truth is, for a lot of people, sharing that they're doubting is an extremely vulnerable thing to do. As we said earlier, so many people never do. So it's been grateful. I really appreciate you, like, you sharing that. I know that couldn't have been easy to say that. And if you can get it, say, I get it, I understand. Like, this isn't, don't make them feel like a freak for having, like, you've doubted your faith. Like, just being like, oh, mate, like, I appreciate you saying that. And that is rough. And you know what, like, the amount of times I've just thought it would be so much easier to give up. Like, I 100% get that. But I was like, let's chat it through. And everyone's different. So for some people, they doubt because it is like, mentally, they're like, I just struggle academically with the thought of there being a God. For a lot of people, let's be honest, it's more of a kind of, okay, speaking very frankly, I'm in my, I was going to say 20s. Oh, and I'm 33. That's a lie. There's a lot of people. Coronavirus is this season. I'm losing track of days and years. A lot of people, I'm going to speak honestly here, in their 20s and 30s, it gets to a point, I have a lot of friends like this who are single, and they're just like, my conviction was I was only ever going to marry or be with those who pulling me towards God, because my faith is really important. And so I only want to be with someone who's running in that same direction. And what often happens is they get to 20s, 30s, sometimes even 40s, they're still single, and they're just like, do I really want to give up everything for this intangible God who doesn't really seem to do a whole lot for me? Um, and then I've seen a lot of doubt come off the back of that, where it's actually, and again, you have to be very empathetic with that. I mean, a lot of people have sacrificed a lot for God, and church culture has been rubbish at helping single people. Um, but I think that's a very different type of doubt that you have to be more aware of how to handle that, because there's probably deeper issues than someone who's like, I just read this book by this famous atheist and I'm struggling with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, I totally get that, because I think we're not very good sometimes at being honest with ourselves. So actually, the doubt that they're saying they have isn't the doubt that they really have. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't believe in God because I believe in science,
Yeah.
which is a nice way of saying, I find the thought of God uncomfortable, so I'm going to bury it in something a loosely popular culture has given me, but I've not bothered to investigate it. But actually, I just kind of want to live for myself, and I don't really want to be bothered with that stuff.
That's a great point. I think a lot of people actually, when they're saying that they're wrestling with doubt, is they're not necessarily wrestling with, is God real? They're wrestling with, is God worth it? Because
Yes.
sacrifice is painful, and the truth is, for a lot of people, when they become a Christian, there's not, like when we think of early disciples, where it's like, count the cost, carry your cross. It was like, you have to put your life on the line, and so sacrifice, you knew from day one, like, this is going to be a struggle. Whereas for a lot of us, I put myself in this category, becoming a Christian, it wasn't like my whole family rejected me, or I had to give away everything and whatever, and so we're not used to that sacrifice. But then there does come a point where, for some, it's like, wow, I'm really feeling the pain of this. So again, going back to the singleness thing, look, I'm 33, I'm unmarried, I can relate to this, and it gets that point where you're like, all my friends are married now. It feels like everyone I know is in a relationship, having kids. I'm still single, and I'm not so much to begin with wondering, is God real? I'm just asking, is he worth giving up the possibility of maybe being married or having kids? Is he really that good? Or maybe you could say, yeah, is the question, is God good? And I think you have to handle those two things slightly differently. And often, I'd say very often, that overlap, that personal experience, the heart thing and the head thing, often are very connected.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I think you've touched on a really interesting point there very quickly, that the kind of yin and yang, as it were, it used to be black and white, very much, as Jesus says, you can't serve God and mammon. Whereas now we've got to this point where everything's so comfortable, we want to have both worlds. We want to have the world and God. And if it gets too uncomfortable, we'll just go for the world.
It's nice to be able to talk about these things. I mean, it's funny because I think obviously we're talking about doubt and stuff now, and both relaxed about doing so. But for a lot of people, this will be such a free and life-giving thing hearing it, because they literally will have never really heard people talk honestly, and kind of doubt in a sort of hope-filled way. Not like, I listen to a lot of deconstructionist podcasts, and it's just like, as I said earlier, there's so much of just tearing down, and like, you're like, yes, I agree with all your questions, and you've given me no hope for rebuilding or no answers. And it's like, yeah, as much as I enjoyed bashing the church with you, I didn't feel like you gave me any tools for rebuilding. So hopefully we're kind of doing a bit of both.
Well, it's so often the way, actually, in kind of popular culture anyway, isn't it? People are very good, whether it's the press, whether it's, one political party to another political party, it's all about tearing down. And it's like,
yeah,
let's, like, society and all that kind of stuff, we need to be constructive.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think ignoring the problems, as we've said, like, is not the solution. But I don't think the solution is just fixate on the problems. I think you do like in my own life, I had to deconstruct first before I could rebuild things. But I think the problem is with so many of the very popular Christian deconstructionist podcasts is it's just, let's just spend an hour talking about all the awful things that evangelical Christianity did for us, rather than like, yeah. Anyway, so that's I used to love them. Now I hate them. It's like, okay, you've been deconstructing for 7 years now. Like, when does the deconstructing end?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're absolutely right. It's really important in your personal journey often to have those little crises, because although they're horrifically unpleasant, those are the points where you then are able to build up. And once you build up, you are a lot stronger than where you were before, because now you've come to a conviction. It's not just something someone told you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Whereas if you just stay at that level of, oh, let's just pull everything apart, it's just so unhealthy as well.
Definitely.
Like mentally.
Yeah, 100%. I agree.
Cool. So obviously the books, we've talked a little bit about doubt, and but moving on more generally, the kind of theme of the book is obviously authenticity. And there's certain points in the book where you are very authentic and honest, and I guess to some extent that comes with the territory of writing a book of that nature. But still, I do admire that, and like I just want to read a little example of that. So from the chapter on success, which we might come to in a bit, you say, there have been moments when I have seen people in my church who have the things I wish I had, and sinful thoughts have begun to arise within me. Things like, they may be rich, but I choose a more noble, low-paying career. They might be married, but they settle for less. Yes, they get to preach more than me, but I'm far better, and everyone will eventually see it. So stuff like that is really bravely vulnerable, and just to level the playing field. Yes, I've had thoughts like that and still do as well. So, but the question is, have there been positive side effects to this? Have you seen kind of results of this kind of vulnerability and honesty? And have there been negative ones? Because you're making yourself quite open there to attack and that kind of thing. Has any of these things kind of come up for you?
When I was growing up, people talked a lot about the grace of God and the gospel and that sort of stuff, but I don't think I really fully grasped it until I thought I was awesome. Like I thought I was better than everyone. Like I remember when I was in school, being like, man, like all my Christian friends are rubbish Christians. Like I'm an elite Christian. I'm better than everyone. I was super judgmental and yeah, but everyone thought I was this, amazing Christian. And then God in his real mercy did one of the best things he's ever done for me, which was reveal just how deep and dark my heart, the sin in me goes. And it's one of the best things and most painful things that's ever happened to me. And if you've never had that moment, I would encourage you to pray for it. It's horrible, but it's the best thing you can ever do. And I think when I discovered the grace of God, it radically changed my life, because for me, understanding the grace of God, which is basically saying, or the gospel, just the core of it is, you did not earn your salvation through being good enough. What you brought to it is your sin, your depravity, your darkness. And we like to kind of say things like our mistakes, like our mess. Yeah, a mistake is like I knocked over that glass of water. Sin is there's a lot of, well, I mean, you can read the book and I share some of my stories. It's not like the sin was when I was 12 and now I'm perfect, like it's still going on. And I think seeing that, for me, like I didn't read a book on vulnerability. I didn't listen to some inspirational talk on it. It was just a natural overflow for me of seeing just like, for me, it shows a lack of understanding of the gospel and the grace of God if you're not able to talk about your own sin. And sadly, I would say that's the norm in church, and that should concern us. It's the norm that church leaders and small group leaders and just ordinary lay people don't find it easy to talk about their sin and struggle. Even I was in a small group meeting all about authenticity and honesty, and it was one of the most shallow discussions for like the first half an hour ever, and shallow discussions and then thankfully it eventually changed. But how it changed was because somebody was honest and just started to share. And I think one of the things that has led me to really value vulnerability and honesty is just the power it has. So it's amazing, like when you're in an environment where no one is being honest, if you're that person who actually opens up and says, this is what I'm going through, it has an amazing ability to bring such freedom to people. Like one time I was in a church service where there was a preacher did an amazing talk all about hopelessness, and he was talking about how we can find hope in Christ, and we've all been in hopeless moments. And I was so excited for him to share this moment of when he'd been hopeless and desperate for God and at the bottom of it. And then the sermon ended, and I was like, wait, what? Why didn't you ever share? And I was like, and then he's like, we're going to do an altar call. Come forward if you want prayer, if you need hope, if you're feeling hopeless, we're going to pray for you now. And no one came forward. And I was like, and I was kind of anchoring the meeting, kind of the hosting it, emceeing it. And I said to the preacher, I was like, do you mind if I just say something? He's like, yeah, yeah, go for it. It's like one of these awkward moments. Everyone's looking around like, why has no one come forward for prayer? And I got on the stage and basically it was like, I know what it's like to be at the bottom of it, just darkness, no light at the end of the tunnel, not wanting to be alive. Like I've experienced it, I've been there. I just, I can relate. If that's you, I've been hopeless. But I want you to know that you can have hope, that there is a light, even though you don't see it right now. And God has revealed that to me, and He can reveal that to you. And I'd love to pray for you, and we'd love to pray for you if that's you. So why don't you just come forward now? And then, yeah, it was awesome. By God's grace, it's all these people just started coming forward for prayer, loads of people. And this one guy came up to me and he was like, I've never said this to anyone before, but for the last few years, I've been cutting myself and I've never told anyone that. And he's like, for you to say that you struggle with depression, you feel like a safe person for me to open up about this with. And I love that. That's the case, that just from a little bit of just honesty of I know what it feels like to open up, it makes you this safe place where people feel like, oh, they're going to get it. Like with the doubt thing, if you are open, then you're going to be a haven where people come to. And so yeah, and you said, has that, like, what's kind of people's reactions? It doesn't always go down. My experience is, yeah, some people, they actually want, especially church leaders, they want church leaders. We say we don't want to put them on a pedestal, but really we want them, to be this perfect person who we can admire, and they never sin and they never have struggles. And I've had multiple kind of people, especially church leaders, say as a church leader, you shouldn't be honest or kind of vulnerable, or at least talk about current struggles, maybe if it was 20 years ago. But for me, the most powerful results have come from just talking about the grace of God in my own life through my own stuff. So, for example, I recently talked about how I've had counseling, and so many people came up to me and was like, I've never heard anyone publicly say they've had counseling. Like, and I had lots of people ask me where I got it, what it was like. And then I had a couple people say to me, I don't think church leaders should admit that they've had counseling. So there is a pushback. And I think that doesn't bother me. It saddens me, but I don't get kind of insecure about it. I think the truth with vulnerability is you can't have both vulnerability and control. When you're vulnerable, when you offer up something of yourself, you can't control people's reactions. And it's not vulnerable if it doesn't lead to some sort of pain. Like I hear people say, oh, I was really vulnerable then. I talked about how I wish I spent more time with God. Like I only spend about half an hour a day and I wish it was an hour. Like I'm such a bad Christian. I was so vulnerable when I said that. I'm like, that's not vulnerability. Like vulnerability hurts. Like it's painful. Like it is, it's an uncomfortable thing. And you know that people will judge you and think, wow, like you're weak or whatever. But I've seen the power of it so much that I'm never going back. And ultimately, for me, like when you understand the grace of God, I just can't see any other way. Like, why would I try and convince you, Jason, or anyone else that I'm amazing? Why would I hide some of the most, dark or embarrassing bits from my life from the book? Because I've been there. And the truth is, like you just said, you've been there too. Like you've had these thoughts. Like if all the thoughts that I or you had were put on the screen in front of the whole church or whatever, we would be appalled. But we're all there. We're all those who are kind of sinners in need of grace, and it's not our righteousness that saves us. It's Jesus. So I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, and I know that's not the norm, but my prayer is one day it will be.
Yeah, really helpful. There's a couple of things that I want to respond to that with, and they've just completely gone from my mind. So I think one of the things I was thinking as you were speaking was I remember a story of now I've remembered the other thing as well. Great. Which will have gone by the time I get around to it. But anyway, I remember a story of a friend of mine who, very far away, he was in a particular small group at a particular time, and one of the guys, and it wasn't people my age, a bit older. They're like mostly kind of young families, sort of age, parents of young kids. And in his like men's small group, one of the guys basically had the bravery to basically talk about a problem he had, which was like, basically, my marriage is on the rocks, and I'm addicted to porn. This ain't great. I need help. And apparently, like, there was a bit of an awkward silence, and then someone changed the topic, and that was it. And so the guy I knew was like horrified, because he was like, this is like so I just mentioned that story, maybe to make the appeal that, like, if someone has the nerves to be vulnerable to you, we cannot be embarrassed and let that go. Like, we have to respond and deal and approach it, and embrace people in that situation, because as you say, it hurts a lot, and it takes a lot of effort to do that. And so I'm almost just taking a second out of the conversation to stand on a soapbox and just say, like, embrace people who do that. And yes, it's not comfortable, but relationships aren't comfortable, and they aren't always clean and tidy. Please don't let people down who are who have gone out of their way and out of their comfort zone to confess and talk about problems. Is that fair enough, John?
That's a great point. 100% agree. Yeah, definitely.
Because it was literally as you were talking that story came up, and I remember at the time I heard it, I was kind of harrowed by it, and I thought, yes. And I'm not saying I would do any better in the situation, but anyway.
No, what I would say to people, I mean, that's obviously a more extreme example of vulnerability, but and yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. And like I say, my hope is that our cultures will change in church. I mean, one of my most encouraging and sort of saddening feedback I get when I preach is, I just love how honest and vulnerable you are when you preach. I'm like, I love that, but I'm like, my desire is that across the UK, like, it will just be the norm, that we won't be I like that. We wouldn't need to have this conversation. Like, my prayer is that in years to come, podcasts on this won't exist, because it will just, the culture will have shifted. And what I would say is, sometimes you have to pioneer a little bit, and I've seen a lot of change in and around me, and I know in small groups, for example, because let's be honest, most of us aren't going to be preachers or whatever, and that's, even for me, only a fraction of my life. It's in those little conversations where you open up and the person goes silent, and you're like, that hurt. And the truth is, not everyone is the right, or not every context is the right context to share in that way. But I'm always keen to be like, I want to be as kind of honest and open as I can. And even if people don't respond well, I don't want to lose sight of the power of it, because it might be, even in that small group, someone thought, wow, I'm addicted to porn, I've never told anyone, and he's just said it, and I'm not in a place where I can share that right now. But maybe down the road, that one moment will have opened up something in that person's life where they're like, I feel like I could share openly one day and bring that sin into the light because of what that person did. But in the moment when it's the dead silence, it's horrible, especially when it's that vulnerable. And we need to change our cultures, obviously. But what I would say, do pioneer with it, and you might be the first for a while, but you can literally change the culture of your friendship group, in your small group, and in your church.
Yeah, I think so. I remember a guy at uni talking about that, and for all of my kind of life up to that point, no one had ever discussed the P word, and I just remember this kind of, it was a pastor of a local church, and him just going, guys, just don't do it. Like, and he talks about, like, that's not the whole talk, but that just stuck with me. And because no one had addressed it before, and he did, and he spoke in that way, like, that kind of soundbite has come back to me time and time again, and has been really helpful. And I've been forever grateful for that talk. I suppose, do you think, is there an aspect to which vulnerability is kind of like loving people? Because you talk about this pain, and to be honest, the more you open yourself up to someone to love them, the more capacity there is to get hurt, without sounding like I'm from some teenage romance movie or whatever. But that's like vulnerability, though, isn't it? It's like, the more you do that, the more capacity is there for injury. Yeah. But so you haven't had any particular experiences of it coming to back to bite you in the bum, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, your point is so true about its way of loving people, and I think there's few things that connect people more than and knowing that someone else is with you, and even if they don't fully understand that, they get an insight into what you're doing. So for me, whenever I'm chatting to people, I'm always looking for points of connection. So, say for example, someone's sharing a specific sin that they struggle with. Now, I might not struggle to the same extent, but I am a firm believer of that. At root, there's no sin that I don't struggle with. So, like, one of the myths I used to believe is I would look at other people and say, how can they do that? Like, I'd read the story of David in Bathsheba, for example, or hear about a fallen pastor who'd had a moral breakdown or whatever, had an affair, and I'd be like, that's terrible. How could they do that? And I think the hard hitting message of Jesus is, and he likes to just, anytime we're feeling hypocritical, Jesus is waiting around the corner with a verse that's going to just like smack any pride out of you. And when he talks about, even if you look lustfully at a woman, it's like you've committed adultery. And the same root sin that was in David when he did what he did with Bathsheba, when he had an affair, and even murder, even that root sin of murder, Jesus said, if you look hatefully upon someone, that's there. And so I can't have a look at someone and say, wow, I'm better than you. I can't say, well, how could you? Like I say, well, that could be me too. And that again allows you to be vulnerable, because so for me, talking to you, Jason, I'm not thinking, well, what if Jason, he's never struggled with this or this or this. And yeah, like the truth is we're far more similar than we realize. And vulnerability just creates that bridge. So I'm always looking for those connection points with people. And when people are sharing things with me, I'm not trying to downplay my sin. I'll never forget this. This was heartbreaking, but really helpful for me. I remember I'd been at a classic sort of summer camp, Christian summer camp thing, and I was out jogging with a friend, and I said, "How have you found this week? It's been amazing, isn't it great? How everyone's sharing their testimony." She's like, "Yeah, I've actually found it really difficult." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, every time people were being honest, they would always say things like, well, I went away from God when I was 16, and, I got involved with boys, but I didn't sleep with any of them. I didn't do that. Um, but, God's good." Or they'd be like, I had my rebellious stage and I went away from God and started smoking. I mean, I never did drugs. Like, but yeah, like God's been so good to me. And she's like, I've done all the things that they were like, don't worry, I haven't done those things. It's okay. And it's like, I, I could get up here, I could get up on a Sunday preaching and tell you all the awesome things about myself and hype them and do a classic preacher's exaggeration and make me sound even better than I am. And you might be inspired and you might think, wow, I want to be like him. But that's just not real. And for me, actually, what's far more powerful is saying, wow, this person gets what I'm going through. Yes, they've been there. Like with that whole darkness and depression thing, like they get it, but they've experienced hope. So I'd much prefer you think, wow, John is pretty screwed up, but he seems so filled with like life. What must that be? Because he's obviously not great himself. And I want you to be like, that's Jesus. Like, I'm not awesome, I'm not great, but he is. And that's who I want to point towards. So if I can meet with someone or speak with people, I always want it to be a connection. And yeah, the truth is, it might sound like I'm bashing on churches or whatever, like the same tendency to be proud and make myself look awesome, that is in all preachers, in all people. It's not just a church leader thing. It's just we have an opportunity to do it a bit more widely. It's in all of us, and I think you have to kill that pride and develop that compassion. And as you do, you'll just see amazing fruit in the way in which you try and help and love other people.
I think one of the things you said just struck a note with me about, oh yeah, we're more similar than often we think. And I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who said something along the lines of, there's that verse in James about the confession of sin or something like that. And he was like, I think he talks quite a lot about the importance of that, because it's when something is just within you, that's when it causes the rot. And that's when there's that kind of that disintegration. It's like we go through the same stuff. Like, you need to have someone we can talk to and we can have those kind of conversations with to kind of prevent that rot, because that's when Satan's got you, is when you don't talk to anyone about your problems. And I think for men, this is a massive thing, particularly because that suicide rate is not a coincidence. That's the biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK. And it's because regardless of faith or no faith, people just aren't very good at communicating, I think, because of the vulnerability that it takes. So yeah, if people can get on top of it, maybe, I think what you're kind of campaigning for in that way in the book is actually really important. So just moving on, one of my overarching questions that came up from when I was reading the book was how we make something a reality for ourselves. So, for example, you talk about experiencing grace. I'm just going to actually try and find the quote so that I can give listeners a bit of context. If I can find the right page. So, page 110 to 12. Play the lift music. Yeah, so you say, you may know, on page 110, you say, you may know the theory and theology of grace, but it hasn't fully sunk into your heart. And then a bit later, many of us know about grace, but walk as though we're still under the law. We live under the imaginary chains of needing to be good enough for God or needing to be impressive to others to feel loved, valuable, or worthy of respect. But fully grasping grace frees us from that. It empowers us. It gives us a new identity, a clean standing before God, one that doesn't change even when we screw up. And this really rung true for me personally. And I know what it is. I have known what it is, and I still do know what it is, to just be kind of like knowing the theology of something like that real grace, and yet finding myself living as though I'm trying to keep all of the Levitical law. Well, not literally. I mean, I do eat shellfish, but
And your beard game isn't particularly strong either. I'm just having a little look at the camera, and yeah, I mean,
even in lockdown, it's a bit patchy. So
yeah.
Coming from beard and Bible, I mean, I can't compete with that. So, so how do we? My question is, how do we make those things reality when we're like, oh, I know that's the theory, but I want to be living in the reality of that freeing grace.
So would you say it's that question of like, we know the theory, but why does it seem so hard to take that theory and make it reality? Is that saying kind of your own experience has been, and that seems really common?
Yes, and I'm asking it, and I'm knowing it's a difficult question that doesn't have a straightforward answer, because otherwise the question wouldn't be there. It's just like, how do I just get away from going, yeah, I can teach on that, I could probably give a lecture on that, but actually I'm not experiencing that liberty that it's talking about.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's the underlying reality is there is no silver bullet. Like, if there was just, if you do this one thing, then you'll be fine. There's no one way. A lot of it comes down to kind of what does discipleship look like, and I think there's almost like there's these two elements. There's being kind of convinced of something, but then even when you're not fully convinced, it's like doing something off the back of it that then kind of makes you more convinced. It's like, some people compare it to like the two pedals on a bike. Like, when you press on one, you then press on the other, and then you get that momentum. And I think the start always has to be your head and your heart, like believing. You're not gonna, for example, going back to the authenticity thing, you're not gonna live an authentic, vulnerable, honest life unless you believe this is a good thing. But then if it just stays theory, if you just kind of read my book or listen to some TED talk on it, and you just say that sounds really cool, but you never do any of it, then I don't like this phrase "fake it till you make it," because that sounds so ingenuous, which is ironic when I've written a book on authenticity. But there's this concept of, you never fully believe something till you do it. I mean, I suppose there's that bigger kind of biblical concept of faith and action are so linked. Like, you can't say like, I believe in God, but I'm not going to live it, or I'm going to say, oh, I believe it's important to help the poor, but I ain't going to open up my wallet. Like, there's these two things of belief and action that have to come hand in hand. And I think what I would say is, if you're someone who's like, all right, well, I want to grow in, I really admire people who can share openly about this and this. Well, the truth is, it didn't just come easily. It wasn't like So for me, as I said earlier, I got convinced of the grace of God. I didn't have to kind of start beat myself up and say, John, you need to be more honest with others. Like for me, it's like, what? Who am I kidding? Like if I really believe this, I need to live this way. But then it's a change because I was that kid who everyone thinks is awesome. So like when in my book I talk about times where, I have these thoughts, or times I was the kid who'd never been drunk. So the first time I drank or whatever and got drunk, like I don't want people to know. But then it's like actually I can pretend like that doesn't happen. But if I genuinely am convinced that vulnerability is important, I need to start walking out in that. And so I would just say, like with anything, get your mind, get your heart as convinced as possible. But then it won't, if you're waiting until you're 100% certain before you do anything, you never will. And I think one thing we're very good at now, there's so many resources out there at the moment, amazing resources, podcasts, books, blogs, um, articles, all sorts. But we can fill up our head so much of like we're really convinced of this and this and this that we end up doing none of it. Like I really respect my housemate Ben at the moment. He's felt really challenged by God that he reads too many Christian books. Like he smashes them out. Like he's that guy who like next to the chair in the lounge where he reads, he's got a stack of them, and he reads on when we could commute back in the day, commuting, rest in peace. When he used to get the tube into London, he would read a book. Whereas now he's like, actually, I was so much trying to just get more knowledge and more knowledge. And I kept being convicted of stuff, but I never did any of it. So now he's like, I need to read less, take in less content, and start kind of acting it out. So I would say get convinced of stuff, but don't just then move on to the next book or the next podcast or the next conviction. Start living it out. And as you do that, you become more convinced of it.
Yes, I think here you're that his problem that you've just mentioned is something I've experienced as well. So as you were talking as well, I think one of the things that just occurred to me is basically that what you said earlier actually about God and his goodness convicting you of your sin and how deep that went, that actually that's part of the answer, I think, as well. That because it's certainly been for me that until I really have known moments of my wretchedness, and then in that misery gone, yeah, but the truth is I'm still loved. Yeah, but the truth is the cross still happened and that I am not condemned. That's when you start going, wow. And that's when the joy comes in. And it's like, I think, as you say, there's no silver bullet, but maybe part of the answer is actually with something like enjoying grace rather than just teaching on it, we actually need to realize how far we've come. Now, that's not to say that we obviously just go out and go mental to just prove grace, like, but we just need, sometimes we need that appreciation of our own rot, maybe to some extent, before we can start moving into it. But I think that's also really good what you've said about action and not just digesting information and teaching and understanding, but actually making practical steps. And maybe that's where those kind of things like accountability come in, where you have meeting, where you're going for a group study with someone, and you then go, what are the action steps of that group study, and then right, this week I'm going to do X, and someone has to say, well, how did you get on?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up about the prayer element, because I wish I'd included that, because that's so true and probably shows my tendency of I'm often a like self-sufficient person, but actually no, deep down we really do need God, and He is, yeah, the Holy Spirit is our helper. He's the wonderful counselor. He's our guide, and as you say, often prayer can accomplish so much. In my own life, understanding grace came after that prayer of God help me to understand it. And so I think we've always got to start in that place of saying, God, I need you. And there's that desperation, like you say, that leads us to be like, I can't do this on my own. I really do need you, God. So yeah, prayer is just so valuable, so important.
Nearly there, John. One more big question, and then we're on to the quick fire stuff. The last chapter of the book is on success. Now, I just think that's a really important topic to discuss, however briefly or quickly, because the kind of culture in which we live kind of rams down our throat a very particular definition of success in terms of, I often talk about it as the X Factor generation, whereas, it's all about I need to be big and famous, and that's success, or riches and all that kind of stuff. Now, how do we react to that? What's your definition of success? But also, as we're talking about authenticity, I might as well be completely honest that I actually struggle with this as well, and I always find myself kind of pursuing more. Now, I think there's a place for good ambition, but I also think there's very definitely a place for bad ambition. And a book I listened to, which was quite helpful on the topic, was Rescuing Ambition by Dave Harvey. But yeah, what's your thoughts on all this kind of stuff? And can you help me out?
I recently heard someone talk about how in primary schools now, when they ask what do you want to do when you grow up, people used to say things like, "I want to be a doctor or a firefighter or an astronaut or things like that," and um, or teacher, or you occasionally you still get footballer and that sort of thing. I'm sure I said that at one point or another. But they said it's really interesting now, increasingly, and a friend of mine who's a primary teacher told me this herself as well, that people say things like, "Oh, I want to be a YouTube star," or "I want to be a celebrity," or like the kind of the desire amongst people increasingly is to have fame, and fame in many ways is, or an illusion of it, never been easier because of things like Instagram or whatever. You can be a 15-year-old girl who just uploads a bikini pic every other week and you can have 50,000 followers. That's the crazy thing. You can be, a bit of a nobody in your little town, but online you can be a big star, and you can get ads and income just from an online presence. And it's not just kind of young kids on TikTok that struggle this. It's people like you and me, Jason. Like you said, I've wrestled with it loads. Like, how do you take this healthy ambition but it not become this kind of self-serving, like, I need to be wealthy, I need to be famous, I need to be recognized, and instead, as Christians, we believe a completely upside down countercultural message. Jesus said, "The first shall be last." Jesus, the God of heaven, came down in human form, humbled himself, and then washed feet. And it's like that. It's like this whole idea of success is flipped on its head, and I think it's powerful because the truth is, when we chase after success in the worldly sense, it's so fleeting, and then you even get something, and it's like, well, this isn't that much. Like, it's so funny, isn't it? Like you like, for me, like, yeah, I love the idea that I've written a book. It was a cool opportunity, but it's just very easy for me to be like, well, yeah, but I want to do this, or I need it to be read by more, or this, and it never actually satisfies, which is why so many celebrities struggle with depression. And Jim Carrey, I quote him in the book. He famously has this quote where he says, this moment where you realize you get everything you ever dreamt of, and you still feel hollow. And I think that success is this fleeting thing, and the cool thing is that as Christians, we can chase after something that does satisfy. And I think the whole idolatry of magnitude, this idea of it has to be big, it has to be glitzy, it has to have a lot of likes, it has to be recognized. Like, for God, like, it's completely upside down. And what I would say to people is, if you want to make a real difference, just start small. Don't be thinking about, like, I need to, like, as much as I love singing History Maker, I'm a Planet Shaker, like, yeah, if you want to make history and change the planet, just love your neighbors well. Like, one of my favorite things at the moment is literally just chatting to my neighbors. Like, the thing I've given most attention to over the last few weeks hasn't been like, how am I going to get Jon Brown Ministries off the ground during coronavirus, or get Beard and Bible kind of, followers up or something like that. Like, nah, like, it's although interestingly, I did have a moment a few weeks ago where a random meme I shared on Twitter got 200,000 likes, but that's a story for another day. That was a weird moment because my average likes on Twitter, being the famous celebrity I am, is about 2. I think that's usually my average response. So that was a funny moment. But my favorite thing hasn't been the likes on Twitter. My favorite thing has been chatting to Lynn. Like, Lynn is this 83-year-old lady who I've been inviting around to our house and going to her house every other month for about 2 years now. And widowed lady, and she's read my book twice, actually. We had a great chat after she came to a cheese and wine party at our house. And she's like, "I read your book." I was like, "Oh, amazing, Lynn. What do you think?" And she was like, "I hated it." I was like, "Oh, okay." Was not expecting that. Fair enough. All right. Thanks, Lynn. was like, we should talk about it. She's like, we will, but I need to read it a second time. I was like, all right, awesome. And it was amazing because yeah, we just got into a really good conversation about it. And I think the cool thing about coronavirus is it gives each of us a chance, if we take it, and many aren't, but if we take it, to just stop, to not try and start 100 new things and run at 100 miles an hour, but to stop and just take a step back and try and get perspective for what's important. And for me, it's like, actually what's important to me is I'm not praying like, and I am praying big prayers for our nation and for all these big things. But for me this morning, what I prayed for is, Lord, would you draw our neighbors to you? Like, I'm like, tonight, I sit out in our front garden. No one does that unless they're a bit crazy and weird. Like, I sit in our front garden on looking at all these houses that are really close to us, so that when people walk past, I can say, hey, you all right? And they might think I'm weird, but most of them just love speaking because we're in lockdown, and like from a few meters apart, we're just chatting. And then Pat comes out, my 80-something-year-old next door neighbor, who's 2 doors down from Lynn. She walks every day, 5:30. She goes out with her little dog. We have a little chat. And like, for me, that's what I think is exciting, is not being so obsessed with like success being getting a kind of verified status on Twitter, or having people idolizing you or whatever. For me, like, success is loving people, and actually I enjoy it more when it's not known about. And obviously I'm talking about this on a podcast, so you could be like, wow, you're but the thing is, like, no one sees it when, like, this weekend, me and my 2 housemates baked for our neighbors. Like, I mean, it was probably awful and they probably chucked most of it in the bin, but it's like, that's what excites me. And I think and there's lots of secular authors also, like Jordan Peterson, and he's obviously more of a controversial writer, but one of the things he says I think is so true is, if you want to change the world, tidy your bedroom. Like, we have all these illusions of grandeur of, like, I'm going to change this and do that and stop global warming and stop this crisis. That's like, deal with what you can deal with. Love the people you can love with. Start small. And if God gives you opportunities to go bigger than that, take them, embrace it. But be faithful with the small things. And maybe like David, you'll be in the wilderness protecting the sheep, and one day you'll get the call up to defeat Goliath, and that will be your moment. But you might not. For every David, there was probably a load of other people who faithfully did their jobs, who worshiped God in the wilderness, who never got the Goliath call up. And it's not about that moment. Like, ultimately, our life is about honoring God. It's not about me having some platform or people thinking I'm awesome. It's about Him. And when you kind of lose that desire, like, I have to be famous, I have to be rich, like, it's so freeing. And so having that eternal perspective, like, I don't have to get the biggest house here. I don't have to be married. I don't have to have some impressive job or portfolio or whatever. Like, I'm living for eternity. I'm not living for today. And when you focus on eternity and you try and just love the people you have in front of you, I think it gives you a lot more joy than any sort of temporary high that 15 minutes of fame might get you.
Yeah, that's really sound. I think there's a lot of points in there again to pick up on.
You're talking to me about things I'm passionate about, Jay, so that's the problem. You're getting me off on one, and I'm in lockdown, so I'm not used to all this human contact. I'm just like, oh, speak to me, please. I'm loving it. It's great just being able to talk to someone who, you're one thing I really respect about you, Jason, is that you are willing to have the kind of the more difficult conversations, but do it from kind of a hopeful way. And so you're kind of stirring up stuff in me. So if I'm kind of getting carried away, I'm blaming you. It's your fault, not mine. So.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm quite happy for it. I'm just trying to work out where to go first. So yeah, I think the point you made about David is interesting, and I think that's one that Mike Pilavachi uses a fair bit, doesn't he? Like, where he talks about all the time where David was actually just looking after a few shepherds. Looking after a few shepherds? He was looking after a few sheep.
Maybe he might have had a little team, but probably not.
That was when he'd scaled the business up. But at the start, he was just looking after the sheep. And then it says, doesn't it? I think that after he got his kingship, like, the first thing he does is he goes back to the sheep, like, for a start. And there is something for that. And I think, again, like, as you're talking, when I think about my own specific context, I think it's one of those situations, again, like where I talked about earlier, where it's a case of, okay, I know the teaching on this now. How do I make it a reality? And it's a case of, you need a change of heart, and I need to think about identity as well, because I think a lot of success is how I want to be seen and known, and how I want to see and know myself. Whereas if I really grasp truly the way, the eternal perspective, the God perspective, how he sees me and values me, if that is truly sunk into my heart, I think it will change those things. But it's a case of moving that theology again more into the practice, which is something in time maybe. It's a big thing.
Definitely. And just a quick one on that. Like, again, it comes back to the being convinced but then doing something about it. So I know so many people are like, I have an idolatry of money. Like, I do really want to just get as much money as I can. And I've been convicted about that. And I'm like, that's great. You've been convicted. Like, how's it going? They're like, yeah, but it hasn't seemed to change. I'm like, well, what are you doing in terms of your giving to church and to charity? And they're like, well, I just haven't been able to. I'm like, there's probably not going to come a moment where you're just like, because they're like, oh, well, God wants a cheerful giver, and I don't feel cheerful about that yet. I'm like, it's not going to just some day where you're going to wake up and be like, I just want to give everything away. Like, yeah, you might have read a story about that once, but 99% of people, you're never going to have that. Like, if you want to kill the idolatry of money in your life, don't read 10 books on it. Start giving sacrificially so it hurts. Like, I'm tired of the amount of people that I feel convicted. Like, stop being convicted, start doing something. So if you're idolizing money in your life, give away 20% of your income. Just do it. Just start doing it. You'll kill it. Like, don't start reading articles on it. Don't start telling I'm being vulnerable about my struggle. That's awesome, but vulnerability isn't an end. It's a means to an end. The ends isn't just to be vulnerable. It's to feel the conviction and then take action. So again, what a great time in coronavirus. We're again given the opportunity to step back. If for you it's like, even me talking about money now, you're like, oh, I've switched off. Like, no, don't talk about that. That's probably because it's an idol in your life. And when you feel the conviction about that, stop just being, oh God, you're right, I need to change. Do something and kill that thing, and then feel the freedom. And it's amazing when you experience that freedom. Sorry, you got me on my soapbox again there, Jason. What are you doing?
Well, that's fine, because I'm going to get on my soapbox again now and just back a couple of thoughts that stimulated about this whole success thing, and that is, I think, also that the limelight thing. It's not the normal. Like, it's projected as this normality. It's not normal for like 99.9% of people. So stop pretending it can be a normality. B, you might not even like it when you get there. I.e. the Jim Carrey quote. I also remember listening to an interview with Russell Brand where he talked about getting to the top of the tree, and he thought he'd be happy, and then he realised he wasn't happy at all. And guess what? He's doing it's like a degree or a PhD in theology and religious studies, apparently. So those kind of things are very helpful to bear in mind. And then a couple of things that really kind of spoke to me, and I'm continuing to mull over, and hopefully will continue to speak to me on this, is there's one little story which I won't go into now because I'll requote it all wrong, but it's in Pete Gregg's book How to Pray, and it's at the end of the chapter on contemplative prayer. That's a really helpful story. It's a beautiful story about a man who just lived very humbly, and that is a beautiful definition of success. And also the prophet Jeremiah, who I think it was the Life Application Study Bible, its introduction to Jeremiah, just really powerful. How it says, like, basically by the world's standards, Jeremiah was a flop. Like, he had one mission, one thing to preach, and he did it, and no one listened to him. And he not only did no one really listen to him, but he actually suffered for it a lot. You know, he was put in a big hole at some point. I believe like loved ones died and all this kind of stuff. And it said, however, by God's definition, he was a roaring success, because guess what? He just was simply obedient to the call on his life. And I was like, oh, wow.
That's great. Yeah, they're really good. Yeah, definitely. I love that. Yeah, and it reminds me, the one story I share, those points you had about success and fame are so good. Like, you're right, it isn't the norm. And the problem is with social media, it tricks us into thinking it is, because you're not following loads of randomers. You follow your friends and famous people. So it's like you've got your friends and then you've got all these famous people. So percentage wise on my Instagram, most people are famous, or a large proportion, but in real life they're not. And it's the way our brain kind of gets tricked into it. But I think you're right. We can be running after something that when we get there, it doesn't even satisfy. And I love this verse from Paul. I'm trying to remember exactly where it is, but it's basically like desire to live a quiet life, and it's like have ambition for like that. Actually, is more success is like living a life which honors God. Seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added. And it may be that you one day get the platform or get the opportunity to do huge things or whatever, but actually it's not about that. It's about seeking first the kingdom, and then everything else gets added. And that gives a peace of knowing that, rather than thinking I have to achieve X by the end of my life. It's just having a peace in that I'm just going to serve you, God, as well as I can, and just have the peace of having a quiet life.
Yes, I think so. And I think, one of the things if people ask me like, what's the dream, what do you dream for in your life? What's the kind of aim goal in your career or whatever? I always start my answer with, well, I'm going to say this, but I do realize that often you think you want something, and when you get there, it's not what you thought it would be. And then I'll go on to say, this is kind of what I'm gunning for. And I say that because I remember thinking as a 17-year-old, I really want to do photography and I want to be a professional photographer. Can you imagine what it's like to be paid to do your hobby for a living? Oh, it must be just a dream, blah, 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 blah. And to some extent, yes, it is that. But my experience of it thus far has been, actually, I've spent quite a few years in quite a lot of discomfort just through the stress of it, actually. And now that's not a complaint, but that's just to say, actually, it wasn't like the 17-year-old's naive dream in many ways, because when I was thinking of that, I wasn't thinking of all the pressures that are involved. I wasn't thinking about client demands, about deadlines, about having to shoot stuff that I actually don't want to shoot, and all this kind of stuff. Again, that's not a complaint, because there are plenty of positive sides, but it's just that often the reality of these things isn't what we perhaps imagine it to be. And in a Christian perspective, again, I think the more success you have, the more influence you have. There's direct verse, isn't there, saying basically, you've got more responsibility and more influence you have in that. And so actually that's quite a challenge to be in that position where you've suddenly got, like, if you're a pastor of a mega church or something like that, like, that's a lot of weight on your shoulders. Yeah, so that's my soapbox.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we're similar. I really like that. Yeah, you're talking about it in such a helpful way. And I don't know if you're into something called the Enneagram. I'm what's called a 3 on the Enneagram, which is known as the achiever. So I'm someone. It's like my personality type is, I often find my worth in my success. And on the positive side, like kind of driven and productive, but on the downside is this kind of desire to be successful and recognized and whatever. And I think one of the things that's helped me most to deal with some of the shadow sides of my personality is actually a lot of the stuff that John Mark Comer has been talking about recently. And if you followed his stuff, it's excellent. The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. He's got a great podcast as well with Jeff Bethke. And a lot of what he talks about is not so much focused on the end goal, but on practices or rhythms, daily habits that we do. So, for example, when coronavirus started, had this been a few years ago, I'd have been like, right, okay, I'm going to learn the ukulele, I'm going to learn Spanish, I'm going to get a 6-pack, and then set all these goals, these high goals, that what would have happened is I would have maybe achieved half of one of them and felt rubbish that I hadn't done the other ones. Whereas now more what I'm focused on is, all right, and I'd say I want to read the whole of the Bible or whatever. Whereas now I'm like, I just want to try and spend some time with God every day. I'm not going to put a time limit on it. I'm just going to say, I'm doing this thing called Lectio 365. Pete Gregg, who you mentioned, it's an app that 24/7 prayer, I think, have put out. Just a 10-minute kind of meditational, devotional thing. Listen to that. I pray with my housemates. Try and spend some extra time with God if I can. Try and do that. I'm not saying I'm going to try and get a 6-pack by the end. I'm like, every day I'm going to try and have the practice of having some exercise during the day. And that's been really good for me, because I think goals have been helpful in my life to keep focused, but they can also be, how do you pitch that goal? So do you say, like you say, where do you judge that success? Because either you make the goal too high and you don't reach it and you're disappointed, or it's too low, and then I think for me, having those daily rhythms has been far more helpful than trying to kind of reach some points. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's a really helpful perspective. Actually, it's keeping grounded and not forgetting about today in your pursuit of some distant future that may never happen, and missing all the good opportunities there are for you today. So let's crack on now, just before we finish, with the quick fire questions, or as quick as possible fire questions. John, what one thing do you know now that you wish you'd known when you were 25?
I wish I'd known you look terrible with a goatee, John. Don't do it. It doesn't look good. It's not worth the risk. Never do that ever again.
Okay. Why does God allow suffering, on a similar note?
Very similar question. I would say I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do know what the answer isn't, which is that it isn't because he doesn't love us. Jesus coming to earth and dying the most horrendous, painful death, experiencing the worst kind of suffering for us, makes me completely convinced that when we experience suffering, it's not because God isn't good or doesn't love us. And whilst we might not understand it, I do believe that there could be a good reason, even when I don't see it, because God is far bigger and sovereign. And so, yeah, I don't fully know the answers. Anyone who claims to be able to fully understand why God allows suffering, I wouldn't take too seriously.
How do you keep going through discouragement/dark night of the soul?
Yeah, I'd say it kind of links into something you said earlier about our feelings going up and down. I've learned to try to not take my emotions too seriously, knowing that some things are more seasonal, and that this doesn't have to last forever. Even when it doesn't feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, there is always hope. I'd encourage counselling. I had some really good Christian counselling 2 or 3 times. That's really helped me. Professionals who know how to navigate you through the dark night of the soul. And then I would say the big things are, don't run from God, run to Him, take your pain to Him. You'll be tempted to ditch church, to ditch prayer, to ditch spending time with God. But read the Psalms, read those ones where people are pouring out their heart. Don't run from God, run to Him, stay in church. And linked to that, don't run away from people, run to them. You need community, and it'll be painful because you'll just want to isolate. Not that you have much choice in that at the moment, but don't run from people. If you're experiencing anxiety at the moment, don't keep that hidden. Share that with people. Keep connected as much as you can.
Amazing, amazing. What's your top book recommendation?
The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer.
It's a good book. I read it earlier this year as well. I'd second that it is that's worth a read. If you could send one tweet-sized message to young adults, say 18 to 13-year-olds, what would it say?
I would say, please, please, please buy my book. I'm desperate. I need the money. Please buy it. More real Jon Brown. No, I'm joking. That's definitely a joke and a / ironic shameless plug. But no, not ill, not that. In all seriousness, I would say slow down. There's so much busyness. I know it feels funny to say that during this season, but I still see people not really embracing the opportunity to look back at how we've been living, far too hurried, far too just packed in our schedules, including myself. So I'd say slow down, turn off your screens, don't numb, don't just kind of just gorge on more social media, more Netflix, more WhatsApp, whatever it's like. Just get your screen off, get outside, and enjoy God and His people, connect with people, exercise, make the most of God's creation, and embrace today, and don't freak out too much tomorrow. Freak out too much about tomorrow. Wow, that was the final question, and I just, I want it to be nice and slick and punchy, but hey, it's more real, Not everything is perfect. Sometimes you gotta just let things slide in, and even when you try your best, it doesn't always work out. But it's about your heart, It's about your heart, Jason. There we go.
I second that, John. I think you've authentically kind of brought the interview to a great close. Yeah, is there anything else you'd like to add, or are we?
No, I've just been so grateful for this opportunity. I also just realized that my last comment was definitely not tweet size. That was far beyond tweet size. But yeah, I guess I just went off on one because I've enjoyed this conversation. I think what you're modeling through this podcast, Jason, is something I hope that people will model in their own friendship groups and small groups, and whether it be in lockdown now, or if people are listening to this and they're like, "What was lockdown?" Like, model this now. Like, I think the cool thing about this season is we have an opportunity to just be more intentional about everything. So some of my friends now, like, I've realized so much of our conversations were more shallow than they could have been, and shallow conversation is awful over Zoom or FaceTime. I don't know if you've experienced it. It's just so tiring and just rubbish, and it's like, let's take this as an opportunity to go a bit deeper, and you're modeling that through this podcast, like the way you've asked questions that show you empathize and understand. The reason I've been able to kind of just speak and just riff off on stuff is because you're someone who's exploring and caring, and I would just say what you've modeled, I would hope other people really take hold of that in this season of wrestling with things and connecting with people and going deeper in their faith.
Well, thanks very much, John. Appreciate the encouragement and the kind words. And yeah, I'm really hoping and praying that fruit comes out of it all. But thanks once again for coming on and giving of your time so generously. And thanks again for writing the book, More Real, because it was really helpful and it stimulated a great conversation. So thanks for coming on. Take care. God bless.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, John. That was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed that. Listeners, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it too. If you want to get in touch with John, you can find him on Twitter at Beard and Bible, and on Instagram also at Beard and Bible, all one word. We will put in the show notes links to where you can find the book, More Real, and also any other relevant links from the show. We would love to know what you think of it too, so please feel free to get in touch, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, guys.